From being mocked to superstardom, how one interview changed Poatan's life forever.
At the end of the day, no one knows who the is. And he's going to be that guy when I'm world champion, when I'm a legend. He's going to be at some pub talking some shit about, I beat that guy one time.
MMA fans, when you heard those words from Adesanya back in the day, would you have imagined that it would later turn out to be an iconic interview? Something that would eventually turn out to be the worst nightmare for Izzy? No, right? But with just a few words, he might have mistakenly poked a sleeping bear. His arch-rival Alex Pereira, who heard all that and decided he needed to do something. That something would be to conquer the legend of the Last StyleBender again. Needless to say, now this led to a turn for Pereira, who went on to be the phenomenon that is Poatan and one of the most beloved figures in MMA today. A fighter once mocked by Izzy became the champion by beating him. Meanwhile, Adesanya has been on the downhill for the last 2 years, and the catalyst for all this? One single interview by Israel, a few words that set the entire future in motion. What a turn of events. Two fighters went in two different directions after an interview. While Poatan went straight to the top from nothing, Adesanya, who was at the top of the game, went down the hill and is still rolling down as fast as possible.
Do you regret calling Alex Pereira that guy in a bar? If you could go back, would you say it again?
I don't regret it, no, because I was right. And also I don't because it motivated him. It's, again, I love this fucking story, eh? It's just the best.
Today, let's talk about how one interview led to the rise of a phenomenon that is Alex Poatan Pereira. But before we get to that, let's break down the rivalry between the two stalwarts. Now, Poatan's rise wasn't just about raw power, it was about domination. He became the first fighter in Glory history to win 2 titles in 2 different weight classes. His left hook was deadly, and then he came on a collision course with Adesanya. It all happened in 2016 and 2017 when Poatan handed Izzy 2 of the most brutal losses of his kickboxing career. The first one was a unanimous decision loss that left Adesanya with a bitter taste in his mouth as he left. As he felt he had won the fight, but the second one was the worst. In the second fight, he was knocked out cold by a brutal left hook from the Brazilian. From that moment on, Poatan became Adesanya's boogeyman, the guy who Izzy just couldn't seem to beat. It was personal for Izzy. Just to make matters more in Poatan's favor, the Last StyleBender probably gave up on his kickboxing dreams and went to enter the MMA cage for a change, and that became permanent. But here's the twist, folks. Israel not only was just fighting, he went straight to the top. In 2018, he became the undisputed UFC middleweight champ. He was undefeated in the octagon and still the baddest dude in the division. He was living the dream, dominating the game. Fast forward to an ominous day, March 4th, 2020, when Izzy gave an iconic interview, one that probably changed the course of the whole sport.
And I got knocked out, my first and only ever knockout loss, and then my only back-to-back loss as well. So for me, it was a lot of learning. But I'm glad it happened because I wouldn't be here where it was. And even the same guy now he watches all my fights, and every time I fight, like clockwork, he'll try and put something out like, I beat this guy. But I've never ever watched any of his fights, ever.
Israel Adesanya was talking to Sporting News Australia, and he was asked about Poatan. His response, oh, it was a savage one. Izzy basically said,
at the end of the day, no one knows who the he is. And he's going to be that guy when I'm world champion, when I'm a legend. He's going to be at some pub talking some shit about, I beat that guy one time.
Oof, he straight up dissed Poatan, saying that the Brazilian would be nothing but a forgotten name, just sitting there, reminiscing about beating him in the past. Tupac might have been proud of this kind of hot diss, simple words, but history was about to record all of this. And it turns out that was exactly the motivation Poatan needed. Pereira was down and out, but that was the spark he needed to change his entire trajectory. After that interview, Poatan was convinced he had to conquer StyleBender once again. He wanted to prove Israel wrong, so he had to dive into the world of MMA. It wasn't an easy transition. It was tough for him to go from using his fists to perfecting a whole new arsenal of moves. But Poatan wasn't scared. If anything, he was fueled by that disrespect. Within 2 years, Poatan was in the UFC. He started his MMA journey in 2021, and let's be real, his striking was still on another level. The guy was sending people to the shadow realm with his left hooks and knees. His first few fights were a reminder of why he was such a feared name in combat sports. He fought through a tough middleweight division, and all the while his ultimate goal remained in focus, to face Adesanya in the UFC and finish what he started years ago. Meanwhile, Israel Adesanya continued his dominance. The man was on top of the world. He was defending his title with ease. It seemed like no one could touch him. He was at the top of the MMA mountain, a champion with no equal, but despite his success, there was something in the back of Adesanya's mind. He knew what he said about Pereira, and he knew that one day Alex would come knocking at his door. And finally, we all heard that loud knock on the middleweight title gate once he finished Strickland with a vicious left hook. The moment had arrived. Adesanya versus Pereira, two arch rivals, facing off in the UFC octagon. The energy was electric. Fans were buzzing, analysts were debating, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Props to Dana for his knack for finding narratives in the fight game. Poatan had made all the effort and reached where he wanted to go. He was about to go toe-to-toe with the champ, Israel Adesanya, the same guy who laughed at him, the same guy who thought Poatan would never be at the top again. Poatan versus Izzy 3 was official for UFC 381 on November 12, 2022 in New York. The rematch, but this time in MMA. Poatan had to go through a lot. He was straight up dominated by Izzy, and heading into the fifth, it felt like he was dejected and was on track for a pretty horrible loss. That too from his arch rival. Maybe it was too much for Poatan. He was a great kickboxer, but maybe in MMA he wasn't the best. But out of nowhere, Pereira rocked the champ, and finally we saw what we'd never seen. Crazy scenes. Poatan got the knockout win in the 5th round, clinching the UFC middleweight title and putting a serious stamp on his career. He beat Adesanya at his best in the UFC, where the world was watching. Talk about full circle. This was one of the most shocking upsets in UFC history, as Pereira did the unthinkable. Wow, it was something out of a storybook, like David beating Goliath literally with stone hands. Ironically, the same guy who talked the talk couldn't walk the walk. Adesanya's world had crumbled, but he woke up to congratulate the new champ and gave him his props.
Thank you. Thank you for all what you've done. Thank you for beating me, because beating me, he made me a better fighter, a better person.
Now here's where the story really takes a turn. That victory over Izzy didn't just make Poatan the champion, it made him an absolute fan favorite. Fans instantly fell in love with his underdog story. Pereira went from being the guy no one believed into being the champ who proved everyone wrong. His humble beginnings in kickboxing, his transition into MMA, and that one savage interview that fueled his fire, it made him the people's champ. But it wasn't just about being the champ. Poatan's humility, his respect for the game, and his dedication to becoming the best made him a hero in the eyes of fans around the world. He wasn't just out there fighting for glory. Nah, he was fighting to prove that it's not about where you start, it's about how you finish. And that was not the end of the rivalry. There was more to come. Adesanya is no quitter. A year later, in that highly anticipated rematch, Adesanya would prove he's not just any fighter, but a champion with heart. He found a way to outclass Pereira again, but this time he was the one finishing his opponent to reclaim the title.
No matter what, Alex is a great champion. No matter what, he lost the belt tonight, but he will always be a champion. In his story, I'm the antagonist.
It was a victory that put him back on top, but what happened to Pereira? He went back to the drawing board and chose to move up, since the cut to 185 was too brutal for him. He took a fight at 205 and beat the former champ, Jan Blachowicz. Then he was put to the test for the 205 title against Jiri Prochazka at UFC 295. As you might have guessed, he won the light heavyweight belt and went on to have 3 further title defenses against Jamal Hill, Prochazka for the 2nd time, and Khalil Roundtree Jr. As for his next fight, he's scheduled to fight Magomed Ankalaev in the UFC 313 main event on the 9th of March. It will be a tough test for him, considering Ankalaev has good kickboxing game and has grappling that can be a kryptonite for Pereira. But many have come and failed to topple the legend of Poatan. Let's see if Ankalaev can indeed pose some threat to the light heavyweight king. As for the future, it's exciting to think about who may be the potential opponents for the champ. Maybe a crazy matchup with the great John Jones, who knows? Or maybe it's someone else who's rising up the ranks in the division. But one thing's for sure, Poatan's story is far from over. His future in the UFC is looking bright, and we'll be here to watch it all unfold. Of late, we may have seen him spend too much time on the sidelines with his career tour and him meeting with numerous celebrities, but he knows it too well. This all will come as long as he remains at the top of the mountain in the game. He's still got the hunger, the fire, and the determination to keep pushing for greatness. With his knockout power, his mental game, and his fan base behind him, Poatan is poised to remain a dominant force in the UFC for years to come. And that, my friends, is how one interview sparked the rise of one of the greatest combat sports stories ever told. Pereira went from the shadows to superstardom, and It still gives me shivers at just a few words from a nemesis motivated someone so much that he became the de facto face of the sport. If you love the underdog story, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss out on more content like this. Who knows what's next in Poatan's journey, but we'll be watching every step of the way. Subscribe for more epic combat sports stories. But before you go, take a look at the video on your left where we find out more about the unsung hero behind the phenomenon we know as El Matador. His elder brother put his career on pause to help his younger brother to greatness. Let's track Mr. Alexander Topuria and find out more about who he really is.